Get our audio stuff set up on online, and we'll get started.
What are do the webinar people see us, or do they see the slides?
They just see the slides
okay.
and they hear us. Yeah.
Okay.
Do we have very many people on the webinar?
I don't know. We had a few signed up, but I don't know.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Yeah.
Should we start?
That many
Ready?
Yep.
Okay, welcome to Interactions of Society in the Environment Seminar Series. My name is Joe. I always feel like this is a show. It was really funny because last week I had someone say, it was almost like you were on television, you know, which I had done for 12 years. And I just lectured for 2 hours, so I won't talk too much. But first, for those of you who have not been here before, I know some of you are long-timers that have been here quite a bit. What we are is really an intersection of looking at humans and their relationship to the environment. And we have a lot of scientists in the area who we've invited to come in, and different researchers and different scholars, and to speak about their research in this area. So we're always looking for kind of new ideas, new things that people are doing with their research, so that they can give us some new insights into what's going on. And so this particular topic, we're really focused on environmental history. And we came upon this idea because I was next door neighbors with Andrea Williams, who, not related to Dan, by the way. I don't know, we've got another Williams. And she was just next door to me in the hallway over there, and I saw that she was an environmental historian, and I said, Andrea, what do you do? And she started telling me this really interesting stuff. So today she's going to be talking about her research, what she does and what she looks at. We're also joined by Thaddeus Sunseri, did I pronounce that correctly, in the Department of History here at CSU. And he's also going to be talking about his research. They're both looking at, I called it sort of the collision of modernity and pastoralism. I hope I got that close to right. So I'm going to turn this over now to Andrea first, and we can get started. So let me give you this.
All right.
Put that on.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank Joe for putting this together. And I wanted to start by very briefly kind of explaining what environmental history is. I get asked a lot, including from other historians, and and I think it's very appropriate that we're having this sort of interdisciplinary seminar, because environmental history is, as history goes, particularly interdisciplinary. We look at relations between humans and the environment in the past, and that can mean a lot of different things. That can mean built environments such as cities, that can mean animals, that can also mean effects of the environment on historical developments and human people groups. That can also mean more sort of what we think of as the natural environment, which is also, in just about every case, constructed. So in trying to look at specific cases of this, we use a lot of sources that are non-traditional history sources. Historians like to use document-based sources, so a lot of archives. And we use a lot of archival sources too, but we also are maybe more likely to reach across the aisle into other disciplines, other fields, and use other kinds of sources. And so one of the things I want to do with my section of this seminar is to just introduce you to the kinds of materials, the kinds of subjects, and the kinds of sources that we use. And then the other thing that I want to do, hopefully, is to show you that history is an important piece of understanding the present and policy and implications for the future. So on that note, I will get started. So my current project is looking at a few different Mediterranean societies. So I'm looking at 3 case studies, one in Provence, one in northern Algeria, and one in southern Anatolia. And specifically, my question is how did French forest administration in the 19th century affect these local inhabitants in these three places. And I'm looking at French forestry as, first of all, as a form of environmental administration. And within that, it has both social, cultural, and environmental dimensions, and political dimensions. So it's all of these different dimensions, different aspects are intertwined. And likewise, even though there are obviously a lot of differences among these three places, there are also important and underappreciated commonalities. So in the case of French forestry actually reached not just into northern Algeria, which was a French colony, but also into Anatolia, what is now Turkey. French forest agents were hired by the Ottoman state to develop what is called scientific forestry, and I'm going to get into what that means. And also, so on the administrative, environmental administrative side, there are commonalities, but there's also an important socioeconomic commonality, and that is that these three places also had long-standing, deeply rooted agro-pastoral traditions. So in all three contexts, Mediterranean France, Mediterranean Algeria, and southwestern Anatolia, there were mobile pastoralists who herded primarily small livestock, mostly sheep, some goats, between summer and winter pastures. So not just pastoralism, but mobile pastoralism, pastoralism that moved significant different distances seasonally. One reason for that is the environment. Not the only reason. There are also cultural reasons, but the environment. These are regions that don't necessarily support sedentary, intensive pastoralism. By moving seasonally between summer and winter pastures, pastoralists were able to give their pastures time to regenerate. So, there's an environmental, social, and a political, cultural dimension among these three places. Okay, so starting with Provence, but also thinking more generally about the Mediterranean region. This is kind of a typical landscape that might come to mind when you think about the Mediterranean, particularly the Christian Mediterranean, because we drink wine. And so a lot of, this is a picture that I took of Provence, but a lot of Provence is now occupied by vineyards, and other landscapes around the Mediterranean are quite similar to this, particularly Italy, but other places as well. The landscape that you would have seen if you visited Provence 200 years ago is quite different. Wine growing did exist in the region, but it was not by any means as prevalent and certainly not as dominant as it is now. Rather, this whole region used to be largely the domain of sheep and goats, and it was largely a pastoral society. Now you really have to look to find some sheep, and I'm going to show you some pictures that I've taken of sheep, because when I went there to do my field research, I really looked around and found some sheep, but they're kind of hidden away now. They're not so prevalent and not so easy to spot. So this is one change that, one visual change that's occurred in this region. All right. Next thing, I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to the environmental characteristics that link these different places around the Mediterranean. Now, I'm not arguing that all of these different Mediterranean societies, as I call them, have exactly the same ecological and climatic characteristics. You can see significant variation in the monthly high temperatures here, comparing Marseille, Antalya, and Constantine in those three different locations that I showed you on the map. But you also see common characteristics: hot summers, relatively mild winters in all three cases. And when we look at the number of days with precipitation per month, we see similar characteristics. So again, there's a lot of variation. Constantine, Algeria has a lot more precipitation than, certainly than Antalya, and also somewhat more than Marseille. But in all three cases, June, July, and August are the three driest months. So these are hot, dry summers. One thing that those characteristics might make us think of is fires. We get a lot of fires in the summer months because they are hot and they are dry. Also in these regions, in all three regions, fires are a problem, particularly in the summer, and they're primarily human caused. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about fires when I come back to the subject later. But just want you to notice these common characteristics in climate. All right, another common feature, or similarity, I should say, across these different regions in the Mediterranean is the kind of landscape that you might see. So this is, again, this is an old postcard from Provence, from just near Marseille and Cassis, and the entire Mediterranean coast doesn't look like this, of course, but what I want you to notice is just the brush that's lining the ocean here. This might be described as maquis or garrigue. Garrigue is, there are slight differences between the two, but they're quite similar. In general, both maquis and garrigue describe vegetation that is sort of low-lying, not tall trees, very spiny and tough, and also not too pleasant to walk through. In fact, in Corsica, Corsica is famous for having bandits hide out in the maquis because nobody wanted to get them there or even knew how to reach them because they were surrounded by all this spiny vegetation. But another feature of vegetation like maquis is that it doesn't, or it's hard to make this work agriculturally. It's much easier to just graze sheep and goats here and not try to turn this to any serious kind of commercial agriculture. And that's another reason why all of these regions had such strong and deeply rooted pastoral traditions. I also want you to notice that this landscape is quite different from what you would find in northern France. And I'm going to come back to the significance of that now. So, the French Forest Administration developed in new directions in the 19th century. This is a personal photograph of a number of forest agents who are forest agents in training at the French Forest School in Nancy. Nancy is in northeastern France, so very different landscape. It's kind of hard to see from this photograph, but not the spiny little brushy trees and shrubs, but big high growth trees, and much greener and much lusher. So, so these forest agents were trained in that kind of environment, and they were trained very rigorously to regard that kind of environment, that kind of forest, as the ideal forest for really any landscape. This is what we want to achieve. So you can imagine when they went down to the Mediterranean, when they went down to Provence, and even more so when they went across the Mediterranean into Algeria and into Anatolia, they saw what they believed to be a lot of problems, a lot of environmental degradation, because it didn't look like this. And they believed that they needed to fix it, to make it look like this kind of forest. Well, that's the whole point of this. This is still going on. And I want to add that these foresters are not bad guys. I got to read a lot of their personal accounts, their journal entries, their complaints, their frustrations about the local population not accepting their efforts. And they were really some of the earliest conservationists before that term existed. In the early 19th century, these people were saying, my entire goal in life is to plant as many trees as possible. If I plant 1,000 trees, I will die a happy death. And things like that, and I've made the world a better place. But then they would say the people don't appreciate it. They say they don't want this kind of tree. We'll make them understand that they're wrong. And they experienced a lot of frustrations in actually implementing this program of reforestation. And a lot of them would actually call themselves not foresters, but reforesters. And I think that's quite telling, especially when you look at an environment like the Mediterranean that isn't necessarily deforested, or it's a lot more complicated than that. They would not call themselves foresters, but reforesters, like their purpose really is to plant more trees. So the reason that I call French forestry in the 19th century scientific forestry is that this is the first time that the Forest Administration really self-consciously considers itself to be using scientific methods, methods gained from the Enlightenment, from the budding sciences, natural sciences and biology, and also from the development of forestry techniques in Germany, and other models like that, and really emphasis on statistics and employing what they believe to be scientific methods of forest preservation and commercial sustainable exploitation. So they're trying to protect and preserve the forest in a way that they can continue to exploit them, but exploit them sustainably. And that, again, is something that we're still struggling with, and if it's even possible, or if we can even determine it. But that is explicitly a goal of the 19th century French Forest Administration. So what did this look like in those contexts that I'm talking about? So let's look at Provence first. And I'm really just going to focus on Provence and Algeria for this talk because I don't have time to talk about Anatolia, but if you have questions about it, I'm happy to talk about that corner of the Mediterranean also afterwards. So in Provence, this is sort of a zoomed-in old map of the Bouches-du-Rhône department. France is divided into a whole bunch of departments, and the Bouches-du-Rhône includes Marseille down here, Aix-en-Provence, and then Arles over here, right at the tip of it. And the Bouches-du-Rhône had two huge regions for pastoralism. One was the Crau, which is all this country land here, and the other one is the Camargue, which was kind of a marshy region here that also wasn't really very good for agriculture. And the Crau was kind of a natural steppe, a rocky sort of low-lying plateau that, because it had all these little round rocks in it, wasn't seen as ideal for agriculture until about the mid-19th century. So it was primarily used for pasturing sheep in the wintertime. And this is what the Crau looked like in the 1930s, so a little bit after the time that I'm looking at, but you can see it's like this sort of barren, steppy place. It looks very different now, and it looked significantly different earlier too, but it was always kind of have these rocks and kind of open land. So now I need to go back. Okay, so these were winter pastures because these were mobile sheep. So they would spend the winters around Arles, and then in the spring they would travel up along the Durance River to the low Alps, to high pastures in the low Alps, where they would spend their summers and then come back down to Provence the following fall. As a result, they're traveling for about 2 weeks along their seasonal trek. And during that time, they're passing through a lot of different environments because, of course, the sheep don't walk very fast and they have to graze wherever they go. So you can even kind of see in this is another early 20th century postcard. It's sort of romanticized, but you can even see in this picture, here's a sheep here who's just kind of grazing at the roadside, and that's what sheep do. They would walk along, but they kind of graze as they go. The Forest Administration had a problem with this, particularly when they started designating all of this land as forest. And that is exactly what happened. So one of the things the 19th century scientific Forest Administration did is it created a really broad and sort of vague definition of forest that it could impose whenever it saw fit. So we're actually looking at a forest right now. Doesn't really look like forest, but it's true there are some trees. So, so yeah, this was a state forest. And there were some state forests where the Forest Administration said, okay, you can do certain things in this forest. You can graze a certain number of livestock, but they have to be recorded and they have to pay a tax. And then there were other places that were designated as forests, but they were designated as vulnerable forests because they were so degraded that they couldn't support any livestock. And sometimes the so-called super vulnerable forests were the ones that looked the least like forests and the ones that were least useful for other kinds of activity other than pastoralism. In either case, sheep were excluded from a lot of the traditional places where they used to pasture, both in the winter and summer, and during their seasonal trek in between their summer and winter pastures. So it made it increasingly difficult for pastoralists to continue in their tradition, and a lot of them shifted either to sedentary pastoralism, so more intensive, less extensive, or to another industry, or they changed their route to go just across private land because they could buy access to pasture from private landowners more easily than they could get it from the state. So, okay, so I have just a few statistics. I'm not going to throw a bunch at you, but just a few statistics showing how the Forest Administration and some of these other changes affected the tradition and the practice of pastoralism in Provence. So first of all, this is just one community that had a lot of pastoralists in it, Roquefort-l'Abbadou. And you can see over the course of the 19th century, steady decline in the number of sheep and total herds that are using communal pasture. And communal pasture is communal land, so public land that the inhabitants of a community can use. And one of the traditional things they used it for was to graze their small livestock. The Forest Administration created a lot of new restrictions on grazing livestock in these communal lands, especially ones that they called forest. So what you see happening here is not just so specifically that the Forest Administration is saying you can't use this land anymore, but they're saying you have to pay increased tax, only a certain number of sheep can graze on this land in any given year, and they're slowly trying to exclude more and more sheep from this land because they consider it to be degrading the land. So by the end of the 19th century, we have one herd left grazing on the communal pasture, and I don't know, I don't remember exactly the number. I have it in my notes, but I think it was about 10 sheep, you know. And what happened to all of the other herds and sheep? Well, either their owners just sold them for meat and gave up the whole pastoralism thing, or they shifted to meat production and commercial agriculture and used large-scale agro-pastoral farms. So you still see plenty of pastoralism, but it's very concentrated in certain areas among large commercial agriculturalists. Not so much small-scale producers and shepherds leading their herds between summer and winter pastures anymore. There are also other challenges. I don't want to pretend that the Forest Administration is the only one. Certainly isn't. Shepherds faced a lot of competition from other industries. This is olive picking, but fruit and olive trees became increasingly common in Provence in the 19th century, and the Forest Administration was more supportive of this kind of industry because they're forests, you know, they're trees, than it was of sheep and pastoralists. And another serious impact on the pastoral industry was the wool crisis in the 1860s. You can see here's 1860, 1864. French wool prices started to drop and continue to drop for the rest of the century. There are a few reasons for this. One is a commercial treaty that France had with Britain. Suddenly British wool didn't get taxed coming into France anymore, so lots of French market started to buy British wool instead of French wool. Another major factor was the end of the American Civil War, which meant a lot of cheap cotton coming onto the market and sort of making wool obsolete or more obsolete. In any case, it made it harder and harder for French pastoralists to make money on their wool. So by the end of the 19th century, you have this situation where pastoralists are actually paying to have their sheep shorn. They aren't making a profit on it anymore. And the only thing they make profit on, sometimes milk production, but primarily it's meat production. So they're shifting from wool to meat production. So that's what's going on in Provence. Similar but a little bit different across the sea in Algeria. So France colonized Algeria starting in 1830 and then gradually spread out its control over the next quarter century or so. By 1838, a lot of French colonists and officials and military personnel were really concerned about the landscape and the degradation that they perceived in the Algerian environment. And so in 1838, just 8 years after the conquest of Algeria, the French government imposed the French Forest Code on Algeria. So this is a forest code that is developed in Paris based on an understanding of forests that comes from the French Forest School in Nancy, northeastern France. And if it was ill-suited for Provence, it's even more ill-suited for Algeria. In Algeria, most of the forests, or what the Forest Administration called forests, were inhabited spaces. Indigenous people lived there. And suddenly, they were told they were not allowed to live there. Forests were not supposed to be inhabited spaces. Is this a coincidence? No. This was a deliberate mechanism for the French government to exclude indigenous inhabitants from certain spaces in order to marginalize them, in order to make room for French colonization, in order to subjugate and sort of tame the local population, and at the same time to civilize them. I mean, again, this is not a clear-cut story of good and evil. A lot of the French officials and foresters who went to Algeria really thought that they were doing good, that they were helping by kicking indigenous groups out of the forest, by kicking out indigenous pastoralists and forcing them onto other land, and by trying to teach them different ways of interacting with their environment. The result was not so successful, but I'll get to that in a moment. So this is just a map of northern Algeria. There are a few urban spaces, but a lot of it is sort of wild countryside. And those areas were the last areas for France to gain control over, sort of the last areas of resistance of the indigenous population. Okay. As in Provence, Algeria had, at the time of the French conquest, a flourishing pastoral industry. This photograph is obviously taken after French colonization, but it shows you, as in Provence, a lot of the pastoral industry in Algeria is based on sheep, and to a lesser extent goats. And as in Provence, it was also mobile. So one difference is that in the Algerian case, you usually don't see lone shepherds, but you see entire tribes that collectively own a lot of sheep, and they travel seasonally with their sheep from place to place. Okay, so before I get to this slide, the French Forest Administration had very similar effect in Algeria as in Provence, or very similar efforts in Algeria as in Provence. It attempted to limit and ultimately eliminate use of forests, particularly for grazing. And it also attempted to eliminate the practice of occupational burning, in this case burning for pasture, which was pretty common among the local population. Suddenly these activities were criminalized. They were illegal. And when a tribe or any member of a tribe was accused of starting a fire or another kind of forest infraction like grazing in a forest, if the individual who did that could not be found, the entire tribe was blamed. This is the principle of collective responsibility. And this became particularly common in the case of fires. So by the end of the 19th century, whenever a fire happened, a wildfire in Algeria, a tribe was blamed, and it was accused of arson. And it was just pretty much assumed that it was arson. This isn't entirely an erroneous assumption. It's quite apparent that tribes definitely used fire as a form of protest. And we can see that in this graph. So this is charting the annual number of fires between 1876 and 1912. And I'll just add that the Forest Administration became increasingly vigilant, bureaucratic, and widespread in Algeria in the 1870s. So naturally, you would think the number of fires would decrease because, I mean, superficially anyway, because one of the Forest Administration's main goals is to fight fires and prevent fires. But actually what happens is the number of fires increases steadily during that period. And that was partly, or at least partly, because the Forest Administration's actions against the local population were not just accepted and taken lightly. The indigenous tribes, particularly pastoralists who were used to using and living within the forest, fought back against the French administration in whatever way they could. And arson was a common way that they could protest the French administration and the Forest Administration in particular. So what is the result of all of this in Algeria? First of all, the result, if it was to marginalize and subjugate the indigenous population, it was partly successful. I mean, the Algerian War of Independence is a whole other story, but in general, pastoralists were gradually relegated to much less desirable real estate within Algeria. So no longer could they use the relatively lush lowlands. Those were exclusively the domain of commercial forests and agriculture. Pastoralism was limited to the region known as the Haute Plateau, sort of high, semi-barren steppe region. I mean, barren is a subjective term too, but a region where agriculture was very difficult and unpleasant, and nobody else wanted to be. So this sort of gives you an idea of what the Haute Plateau is like. Although it actually gets a lot worse than this. But the other thing that you can see in this photograph, which is from the early 20th century, is that these sheep are no longer mobile. They're penned, and in general in Algeria, the effect of the Forest Administration was to make pastoralism sedentary and intensive, and particularly in places where it was less supportable, where the environment needed more to regenerate, like in the Haute Plateau. How did the Forest Administration fail? Well, it failed to eliminate pastoralism if that was its goal. As you can see, the number of sheep raised and grazing and goats too, raised and grazing in Algeria is actually on the rise. And sheep and goats are still the largest type of livestock raised in Algeria. And this is just 1987 to 1999. You can see numbers of sheep and goats consistently going up every year. But again, they are primarily relegated to that Haute Plateau region and no longer spread all across northern Algeria. So want to finish by going back to France. Okay. And bringing us up to the present. So this is a forest in Provence, and I just have this slide. I took this picture to give you an idea of some of the very structured, very intense regulation that goes on in French forests. They are very much controlled, constructed spaces, even more in some ways than American forests. And by the way, American foresters took a lot of cues from French foresters. Geoffrey Pinchot studied at, or Gifford Pinchot studied at the French Forest School in Nancy, for example. But in any case, very constructed spaces. One thing that France does now, particularly in its Mediterranean regions, during the summer, it excludes humans, especially tourists, but humans in general, from forests between certain hours. In some forests, people are not allowed at all during the summer months. In others, they have to be out by 11 a.m. and any infraction results in something like a €1,000 fine, or can result in a €1,000 fine. And the goal behind this is to prevent forest fires, because humans are the main cause of fires in Provence. These efforts have been largely successful. Forest administration has also changed its philosophy with regard to fires, so there are controlled burns now, but only very recently has it started doing that. But there's also a lot of pruning and opening of the forest to try and make fires less likely. So that's one way in which the forest administration has changed. And then this slide gives you an idea of how the landscape has changed as a result of this kind of regulation. So this is actually the same forest, or another part of the same forest. This is Mont Saint-Victoire. Cézanne did a lot of paintings of it. And this is the same forest, so in early 20th century and today. And you can see this whole valley has been completely reforested. Most of these trees are actually olive trees, so there is cultivation going on here, but it's sort of cultivation that's being conducted hand in hand with regeneration and conservation. Goes without saying that sheep are no longer grazing here, whereas they commonly did up to 150 years ago. There are still sheep in Provence, so here I found some sheep. But like I said, they're a lot less prevalent, a lot less obvious in French society. You have to really look for them. Come on. And transhumance, mobile pastoralism, also still exists. In fact, it's kind of coming back. And it's coming back because for some people, it's a way of going back to the land. It's kind of almost like a hippie movement. You know, I don't want to just raise animals, but I want to walk with them, you know, into the mountains every season. And so there are contemporary shepherds who do the whole seasonal migration thing with their herds. And this is actually this photograph I took on another part of the Crau. So that steppe region, you can see that it looks very different now than it did in the 1930s. It's also divided up mostly into farmland. So this row of trees is actually dividing the pasture area from an agricultural area. And most of the Crau is now used for agriculture, but there are some regions where they still graze sheep and use them as pasture. Sheep are also increasingly appreciated by agriculturalists in a sort of symbiotic relationship. And so this is a fallow vineyard that sheep are grazing on, and of course leaving fertilizer, and that's become somewhat more common and appreciated than it was 100 years ago. And you also see some other kinds of sheep. Sometimes more than the actual sheep, you see sculptures and images and representations of sheep. And this is one example. This is probably my favorite example. This is a roundabout in Provence with, these are human-sized sculptures, and the sheep are doing various things. These ones I think are dancing. There's another one that's having a tea party and things like that. So you can see that at least for the inhabitants of Provence, history isn't dead. they've romanticized their pastoral past, and even though it may not be present in contemporary times, they're still remembering it and celebrating it. So I guess I'll just conclude by saying one of the things I'm trying to show with my research is that perhaps despite good intentions, misguided forest policy had serious social and environmental consequences in the past. And I think similarly, not failing to take into account cultural and political and historical aspects of a context can lead to similar misconceptions and challenges and problems in the present and future. So I think this is a case study, but it's not a unique case. Similar environmental policies are still taking place today, and if they are failing to take into account the history, they might face challenges, first of all, in being effective, and second of all, in being successful. So I think I'll stop there.
Well, while we're switching to Dr. Sunseri, let's take maybe a couple of questions. We'll have a longer discussion as well. I have a question. Dr. Williams. Anything? Yes? You just kind of, you don't have to hold it. I'll just hold it.
Okay. Thank you for fascinating presentation. I just have two questions. The first one was this about what happened just after the American Civil War with the wool price going down. Sorry, the rise of the cotton and the wool price going down. Now, you explained a lot what was happening by the intervention of the foresters in France. Now, why couldn't you say it is because of the prices? So it's sort of market-based sort of reaction that people were simply getting out of business. First question. And second one was that you, towards the end, you said a lot about the failures and you had to understand the history. I definitely agree with that. But you said if you look at what is happening now in Provence and the policy on trying to kick out sort of tourists during the dry seasons, it's quite successful. So it's not a failure. It's successful. And what has that? How do you link that to the pastoralism? It's the forest's reaction to tourist behavior and the way they see sort of forest fires initiated by say tourists.
I can hold it for you.
Okay. To address your first question, I agree. The reason that I raised the point about the wool crisis was to show that the Forest Administration is not the only challenge that pastoralists are facing, and definitely you're absolutely right. They're getting out of the business because it's not profitable for them, and that's exactly the point that I tried to make. With regard to your second question, I also agree. I think that the point that I would make is that we're looking at a vast amount of time, at least by historians' measurements, that I haven't really talked about. So what happened, certainly Provence is now very successful. The tourist industry is very successful. What happened to the actual individuals who were raising and raising sheep, selling wool in the 19th century is a different story. Most of them were not so successful. They faced certain challenges in the process of the broader Provence market economy getting to where it is today. And then I think one more point that I would make is that certainly there have been a lot of agricultural advancements in the meantime that allow much more intensive agriculture, but some of the agricultural and pastoral practices that are being implemented in Provence today are, I would say, less sustainable. The challenge is that the population is much larger, but now what you have in terms, just looking at the pastoral industry now, what you have is one farm raising thousands of sheep on a relatively contained amount of land, whereas in the past you had a much smaller herd per person, per producer. And so it was in a way to engage more members of the population in a less environmentally exploitative activity. So
I'll tell you what, let's move along now then. Thank you very much, Dr. Williamson. Sit right here.
Is that okay?
I want to switch places with me, you can, because I kind of enjoyed using this corner.
Yeah. So it's just the middle button?
Yeah, it's just the middle button.
In these photos for Facebook, like us on Facebook. The 21st century now. Okay. All right. So I'm a historian of Africa, and particularly of East Africa, and especially Tanzania, the country over here. This is a pretty good map of Africa for showing the physical regions. And so essentially pastoralist regions would essentially circle around, you know, the desert areas and circle around the rainforests, circle around into East Africa, and then come back into Southern Africa. The major reason for that is that indigenous diseases, especially sleeping sickness, usually is concentrated in the rainforest regions and in various river valleys. And so for me, a pastoralist topic is a new one. Because in my past research I've always dealt with African farming communities who, generally speaking, could not have cattle because of the presence of sleeping sickness. And so this recent project of mine, and it's work in progress, is moving from what were essentially farming communities of southern Tanzania into pastoralist regions. And in particular, I'm interested in looking at the role of cattle diseases and the intersection with kind of a beef industry. And in a way, this is an evolving work, and I keep coming across things that I didn't expect. All right. And so the starting point is basically a epizootic that hit Africa in the 1890s, which is rinderpest. Rinderpest is the German word for what the English call cattle plague, a particular virus, which was age-old in Asia and Europe, but it apparently only came to Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, in about 1888. And so rinderpest began to, it was essentially a virgin disease. Therefore, it impacted African cattle tremendously, killing at least 90% throughout the continent. Of course, that's spreading around into those pastoralist regions that I described before. This is a well-known photograph from South Africa where rinderpest traveled between 1888 and 1897. Basically showing its impact, but besides the physical cost to cattle, methods of eradicating rinderpest included slaughtering cattle that were infected. And so this is not really cattle dead from rinderpest, but cattle that were slaughtered because of government policy. The idea being if you eradicate all the cattle that might be infectious, then it won't spread to more valuable herds someplace else. Now this is a South African image, and a basic map of rinderpest in Africa shows it, starting in the Red Sea region here by Eritrea today, especially spreading through the Rift Valley, through East Africa, into Southern Africa, and then kind of curving back around. Very few studies really have examined rinderpest in West Africa, but it did skirt the Sahel region and go to West Africa as well. And so as a historian of Tanzania,
Tanzania is right on the path of rinderpest, and it struck that region in about 1891, again killing upwards of 90% of cattle in that region. There have been a lot of studies of rinderpest for South Africa, but not so much for East Africa. And so I see it as my task to piece that history together. Furthermore, in South Africa, when rinderpest arrived in 1897, the South African governments, of which there were several, mustered a great deal of resources to eradicate rinderpest, including cattle culling methods that I talked about before, quarantine methods, but also they began to make breakthroughs in vaccine therapies. And so in South Africa, in Southern Africa in a broad sense, rinderpest was eradicated by about 1900. But for other parts of the continent, that wasn't the case. And so rinderpest held on until it was globally eradicated just a few years ago. And so let me see if I can. And this is a map that shows the extent of rinderpest in various years, 1980 to 1990 to 2000, and then in 2010 marks the year when rinderpest became the second disease, the first being smallpox, that was eradicated. And so it's really quite a big deal, and you can sort of see that the last pockets included parts of East Africa as well as Pakistan. What that means is that the 20th century history of rinderpest for Tanzania was that it was an endemic disease. It never left, and so it always had something to do with colonial policy. This is a celebration of the eradication of rinderpest in Kenya in 2010. And the reason why it's interesting to me is because the monument celebrating the eradication of the disease is of a Cape buffalo. For most of its history, and for Africans in particular, this is a disease of cattle. And this was also a disease that was carried by wildlife, although that was not known for quite some time. But considering the importance of the modern tourist industry in East Africa, its capacity to impair wildlife like Cape buffalo and others has more economic importance today than, in fact, the cattle industry. And so it reflects a shifting of priorities over 100 years from about 1900 to 2010. And so the rinderpest is kind of at the background of what I'm doing, and I'm trying to piece together a history of rinderpest really from its German origins in the 19th century in Germany. Germans colonized East Africa before World War I, followed by the British, and so I'm tracing the trajectory of this disease and how it influenced colonial policy, particularly in the 20th century. Now, looking at Tanzania in a broad sense, this map shows you that there are different ecologies in Tanzania, and so the areas that are kind of shaded orange here are the tsetse regions. Those are the regions where tsetse flies inhabit the bush, and they are vectors for sleeping sickness. And so where there is orange here, you cannot have cattle. Whereas in the drier regions, such as the Maasai steppe, cattle rearing is possible. Now, some Africans in highlands regions can be both farmers and cattle keepers, and so they're part of my story too. But there are some specific ecologies here, and it's worth noting that the sleeping sickness zones, in fact, increased over time, in large part because of the rinderpest panzootic in the 1890s. With virtually all the cattle being destroyed, it gave the bush opportunity to grow back and to increase the habitat of tsetse flies. And so therefore, the map of tsetse regions in about 1940 is much greater than it was about 50 years beforehand. And so that, in part, is a factor of disease. Now, switching ground abruptly, as I began to research the history of rinderpest, it was clear to me that the project couldn't really be done appropriately without looking at the beef industry. And there have been many ethnologists and historians of pastoralists in Africa. I don't consider myself one of them. I consider myself to be more of a historian of what I would call a political ecology of beef. And so what you see here is an image of Chicago stockyards before they were closed down in the 1970s. And the reason why that's significant is because from the beginning of European colonialism, really in the 1890s for East Africa, carried on by the British, and including modern Tanzanian policy, the agenda of all of the states has been to modernize the beef industry in Tanzania. Almost from the moment that Europeans set foot, they concluded that African cattle keeping was done improperly, that African breeds were not very productive of meat and milk, And so this is really the image that they want. They want to recreate the Tanzanian environment to be more productive of beef. And that includes a lot of things. This is an example of a Hereford bull in South America, which is kind of part of my story. And the idea here is to transform indigenous cattle by upgrading them with introduced purebred breeds that can simply make them much more productive. And so you can, I hope you can tell that this is a prize bull that hopefully will produce a lot of meat. And in this case, it's in South America. And so the agenda for Tanzania in the 20th and currently is to upgrade cattle to these kinds of animals that are much more productive. And it also entails transforming the environment. These are images looking at Montana from a period at the top. I should be looking in this direction, but the sagebrush environment at the top is replaced over time. This is the exact same parcel of land with an alfalfa frontier a couple decades later. And so this idea of recasting the environment to grow a fodder grass like alfalfa to make cattle much more productive is an American image, but it also became a South American image, particularly in places like Argentina. And then it's an image that colonial rulers attempted to bring to East Africa as well. And so it essentially does mean recasting the entire indigenous environment in new ways. And this model entails a lot of other things, technology like barbed wire and windmills and water pumps and so forth. So this is the model, the Chicago model, I'll call it, that has not really taken shape in East Africa, but not for want of trying, and it is still a model that's tried today. The model I'm more interested in is what I'm going to call it the Lemko model. It's a model named after a corporation called the Liebig's Extract of Meat Company, which began as a German company but became a British company. And this was a corporation that began to inhabit South America, especially the River Plate region by Uruguay. And I've got these little dots. Which indicate the succession of its ranches and its meat extract factories over time. Unlike the Chicago model, this Lemko model was one that tried to compete for a niche beef market, which I think is best encapsulated by corned beef. Corned beef comes from Argentina and Brazil, but most importantly, it comes from marginal cattle. And so the corned beef industry, which competed with the fresh meat and frozen meat industry, was one that really began to take shape in South America. And so if you go to the Pampas regions over here, that becomes fresh meat country, Chicago model country. But the Lemko model was one that was continually looking for marginal cattle that you could almost call semi-feral cattle, cattle that were the descendants of those brought by the Spanish beginning in the 16th century. And so this map shows that the Lemko model is constantly searching for poor scrubland and poor cattle, and ultimately the prime beef industries drives it out. And so this trajectory going up towards Paraguay between about 1890 and 1920 is reflecting the search for marginal cattle on marginal land where profits can be higher because this is a niche industry. And so the Liebig Lemko model of corned beef really represents Uruguay and then gradually Paraguay during the 20th century. And then this is, you might take corned beef for granted, but it intersects with my interest in disease because if you boil it down and salt it, pack it in cans, boil the cans, you can ship them anywhere in the world without any fear of spreading disease. It's not exactly true, but it's pretty close. Whereas you can't do that with fresh meat. African live cattle could not be shipped to other parts of the world, or African fresh or frozen beef, because of the fear of transmitting diseases, not the least rinderpest during the 20th century. And so corned beef is a niche market that was good for bad cattle and bad lands, such as existed in some parts of South America, but there were ample examples of that in East Africa as well. And so the Liebig corned beef model would ultimately be brought to East Africa as well. Well, I just passed that other slide and I probably won't go back to it. But basically it just shows a cattle roundup in South America with this idea that the corned beef industry wanted semi-feral cattle that were grazing on natural pastures. They had very little meat, but the profit margins could be very, very small for this kind of a niche industry. Bringing it to East Africa, which began in full force by the 1930s, but before that, German colonizers attempted to bring modern beef industries to Tanzania too, meant also transforming African cattle. And so the image you have here is of an East African cow, a zebu cow. They're descended from Indian breeds going back about 2,000 years. And I use this image because it represents a cultural value that cattle have in East Africa that is beyond their productivity for certainly beef, but also even for milk. Rather, this is a decorated cow. It could very easily be used for gifts for marriage, gifts for alliances. It's something that colonial officials hate because it mars the hide so that it cannot be used for the leather industry. And this kind of represents exactly what colonial officials are trying to root out. This cultural association of cattle rather than the economic value of cattle. And so the struggle from German times to now is to transform the cattle for commercial purposes rather than for cultural purposes. These are, drought cattle, and drought cattle are typical for many parts of Africa, but many parts of East Africa. And by that I mean simply emaciated cattle occupying essentially indigenous scrubland that suffer from lack of nutrients for many parts of the year and also lack of water. This is exactly the kind of cattle that the Liebig's Corporation desired for the corned beef industry. And so because East Africa has ample supplies of cattle that cannot be exported for beef, they can be used for the canning industry. And again, this brought the Liebig's Corporation to East Africa beginning in the 1930s. Okay. Tanganyika Packers Limited is the version of Liebig's that was founded in modern Tanzania in about 1950 after World War II. And a related factory in Kenya, neighboring Kenya, was created in about 1937. So this is Tanganyika Packers north of the coastal city of Dar es Salaam, with some of the cattle being penned in. And it kind of represents the beginning of a modern commercial beef industry in Tanzania. But I want to use some cautionary language there because, again, it always relied on these undeveloped scrub cattle. And so to a certain degree, this is the model that was always with tension with state policy, with colonial policy seeking to upgrade cattle and modern Tanzanian policy as well. But this is a factory that was the primary recipient of tens of thousands of African cattle, oftentimes forcibly culled. That is, Tanzanians were told that they must sell a certain percentage of their cattle each year to supply the factory. In fact, it's a parastatal that was partially owned by the Tanzanian government and the British government before that. And so this represents a particular type of cattle industry that I think is, we can certainly call colonial, that can't compete in the wider market for fresh beef, but it can compete in niche markets to supply, for example, militaries with canned beef, for example. Just images from inside the factory of workers. It's a very grisly industry, and from what I can, as best as I can tell from getting into the factory through archival sources, conditions were extremely harsh. Yet these were good jobs, well-paying jobs for their time, and people wanted them. And then you can see the stacks of corned beef next to it. These are just examples of the Chicago model, I'll call it. The Chicago model for East Africa would be drawing on Indian versions of zebu cattle, zebu bulls, to upgrade the Tanzanian herds. And part of what that did was create a special Tanzanian breed called the Mpwapwa bull, and this was meant to completely recast the Tanzanian herds, beginning in about the 1940s. If it had succeeded, it would have created East African cattle that would no longer be appropriate for corned beef because they would simply be too expensive. Yet there was no export market for fresh beef because of the disease factor. And so there's still a tension involved in trying to upgrade and modernize the herds while sustaining an industry like the Tanganyika Packers. Okay? And it's worth noting that the Mpwapwa bull is virtually extinct today. So it's a model that really never really took off. In Tanzania, a year and a half ago, I took this picture of from the biggest cattle market outside of Dar es Salaam. just to indicate that there's still a very high African cultural value to cattle, because you can see the branding, which is kind of etched into the hide here, which again will drive those interested in a commercial leather industry out of their minds, because this basically ruins the hide. But at this particular cattle market, we have examples of the persistence of indigenous cattle raising and the indigenous cultural value bringing their cattle to market. And so essentially it still represents the failure of the modernization of the industry. And so a couple points I would like to make. First of all, the Tanganyika Packers factory went belly up in the early 1990s. That's got a lot to do with Tanzania's transition to the neoliberal age following the Cold War and structural adjustment policies which began to force privatization policies onto the Tanzanian government. And so the Tanganyika Packers factory, it still stands, but it's basically a hollow cave. Therefore, there's no more a corned beef industry in Tanzania. When I was a graduate student in Tanzania in 1990, I would rely on Tanzanian corned beef when I used to go travel locally, make sure I had some food with me all the time. But that is no longer the case. And so instead there are local butcheries, and this is an example of a local butchery about 20 miles outside of Dar es Salaam, really supplying local markets, but a new niche industry, which is the hotel industry for tourism, because tourists going to Tanzania to look at game parks want high-grade beef. It still cannot be exported because of the disease factor. And so this guy is a local butcher who was demonstrating to me the tools of the trade, and if you know anything about cattle slaughter, that's not even a pole axe, and so it's really a very grisly sight for the processing of cattle in this region. I'm using the image of the National Park System of Tanzania to make a basic point. Throughout the history of the development of conservationism in Tanzania, conservationists, those who wanted to set up wildlife reserves and forest reserves, also saw pastoralists as the enemy, much like Andrea described in her presentation. Because they saw African cattle as potentially spreading disease to wildlife, not necessarily vice versa, but it definitely happened, or competing for the same resources. And so conservationists demanded that African cattle be culled, that is, be eliminated in high percentages, or to be kicked out of the wildlife reserves. However, in more recent years, conservationists have been rethinking that, because the modern beef industry requires the kinds of landscapes that are especially antithetical to wildlife migrations. If you think of the modern beef industry as requiring, for example, soybeans and barbed wire, those are associated with the modern American beef industry. Soybeans and barbed wire do much more harm to wildlife migrations than indigenous cattle. And so many wildlife conservationists are beginning to conclude that, in fact, African traditional methods of cattle raising and the traditional markets that I suggested were more in tune with the corned beef industry might actually be the proper way to go. Whether that ship has sailed completely or not is a different question. My last image then is of the Tanganyika Packers factory outside of Dar es Salaam. It's this hollow shell that you can still see here. Right now it's a soccer field and children go there to play soccer. And so it's still kind of a hulk that stands there. A Persian Gulf corporation has purchased the ground. They're the owners of fancy luxury malls in Dubai. And so the Tanganyika Packers factory is very, very close to the luxury homes of Dar es Salaam, not far from the American embassy either. And so the idea here is that it might be recast into luxury grounds for expatriates, for tourists, for embassy officials, but not really for Tanzanians. And so, you know, is this the future of Tanganyika Packers? Basically, my conclusion is that for all of its problems, the corned beef factory was ideally suited to Tanzanian conditions. The corned beef factory facilitated the maintenance of African cultural traditions based on cattle rearing that could have a commercial side to it, but still had basically a commercial value. And so with some regret, the factory has been eliminated, and there doesn't seem to be a future for it on the horizon. And I think I can end it there.
Sarah, I'm going to kick you
Oh,
microphone.
that's right.
First, maybe we'll direct a question to Dr. Sunseri about what he was talking about before he opened things up for a few minutes to both of them.
Should we give instructions to folks on the line too?
Sure.
I don't know if we had a chance to say that earlier, but for the folks that are on the line remotely via webinar, if you want to ask a question, if you can just type that into the questions box, and we're monitoring that in the room so we can look for that. If you don't see the questions box, look for the GoToWebinar control panel, click on the red button to show the control panel, and it should show the questions box in there.
Okay, great. Any questions? I actually hope that.
Is there another part of the story though with like demand for corned beef? Is that a product people buy? Or
When I'm in the market, I look at corned beef, and sometimes I actually buy it, sometimes with some regret, but it isn't cheap. I mean, it is a niche market that, you know, it's got a good shelf life, and some people want it. I think pound for pound it's more expensive than fresh beef. And so there is a market for it. It does seem to come out of Uruguay, Brazil, Argentina. The Tanzanians relied on the British market, and so kind of the former colonial market, and they had contracts with the British military, for example, to supply it. And to a certain degree, I think it was propped up in part by that post-colonial relationship. But it is a commodity, for example, today that has a demand in places like the Middle East and Asia, and there's a big Chinese move into Africa in a broad sense, and a big Chinese attempt to obtain the kinds of pastoralist and farming lands as well as other resources to keep the Chinese economy going. So this is a resource that is in demand.
Anyone else? And so, I mean, my question was, so cattle really become, I guess I'm just kind of summarizing, really a symbol, you know, so that sort of intersects these different, in my field we'd call discourses, or some people call ideologies or paradigms that sort of collide in cattle. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, I never know. And so things are colliding around cattle. Where do you, again, this is asking the historian about the future, and we set a promise we'd do that. Who will win? Where is this going?
Yeah, I don't think it augurs well for traditional pastoralism, and I think colleagues of mine at CSU who work more directly on pastoralist populations in Kenya and in Tanzania point out that a lot of land is being privatized and fenced in. And so I think the trend is toward upgrading, but I guess I'd like to make it really clear that upgrading is really not that easy to do.
Right.
The African disease environment is really very entrenched. Sleeping sickness is still a problem. Rinderpest may be eradicated, but there are a lot of other livestock diseases and wildlife diseases that are present. And so if it were an easy thing to do, it would have been done by now.
Okay.
And so I think that there's still an arena for African pastoralists to maintain a niche. When I was in Tanzania, it would have been spring of 2013 at this point, I was told about migration routes from the arid lands all the way to the coast that cross a lot of people's property, and so all land is not fenced in, and so there is still quite a lot of sedentary, of transhumans taking place. But the state's interest is, I mean, a hallmark of modern societies is to eat meat, and that was the British goal after World War II. And so a hallmark in modern Tanzania is to have citizens who eat meat. And so traditional pastoralism was not meat eating, it was dairy consuming. And so this does represent a real shift in diets and a lot of things about how people live.
Okay, great, good. Thanks for that response. Right, this is your opportunity. We can have at some environmental historians. Any questions just in general?
Okay. The question being is, since we do have some environmental issue here, are the diseases spreading because of the climate change, or hasn't it really been noticed?
I want to be cautious about answering that. Climate change, if you think of it as exacerbating poverty, for example, preventing people from being successful cattle owners does lead to new attempts to obtain protein, which is hunting. And hunting in most parts of East Africa, and I think most parts of Africa, is usually illegal. So it would really be called poaching. That's entering into game reserves or forest reserves and illegally hunting for, and it could be for ivory, but it could also just be for game meat. And so there's a way in which, if climate change is associated with increased poverty, and that's forcing people into the environment in ways that, I mean, they did at one time, but it's technically illegal. We've got a human interaction with wildlife that is not necessarily positive. Now, the Ebola outbreak is because of human interaction with wildlife. It might be because of interaction and hunting of monkeys and chimpanzees, or because of humans living closer to the bat populations. I think bats are considered to be the major culprit with Ebola. But I could go back with the origins of HIV in Africa about 100 years ago, roughly about 1920, where impoverished Africans entering into forest regions, relying on wildlife more than they otherwise would have, and perhaps even eating apes like chimpanzees or monkeys, led to the jump of simian immunodeficiency virus into HIV, therefore becoming a world problem. And so if it's related to impoverishment and people struggling to survive in other ways, then that certainly has something to do with it. In other cases, though, climate change, including aridity, may decrease the tsetse habitats and therefore open up new lands for pastoralists that they couldn't have entered into before.
Other questions? I've got a question. Can I mean, yeah, I know this is, but I do have this question. This kind of goes back to, and I'll focus this on Andrea first. As far as methods, I'm just imagining, so you mentioned, you know, you're in the French countryside, for instance, and you're looking for sheep, you know, and you're looking at things, and you're, how do you operate as an environmental historian? Yes, we have social psychologists here, we have media scholars, we've got, you know, economists, and we kind of know how they operate. And how are you gathering your information? That's what I'm curious about.
Okay. Well, like I said in my introduction, historians primarily like documents, okay. And that remains true for environmental historians. My main source of information is coming from archives, but that can mean a lot of different things. So just to give you an example of the kinds of archival sources I'm using, you saw some old photographs. That's one thing that probably is the most obvious, but not at all the most common. Using a lot of government correspondence, statistics, census data, reports, laws, legislation, court cases. So both quantitative and qualitative data from document-based sources. But then in addition to that, my research also uses things such as field work, so actually looking at the landscape and learning to understand and detect change. You know, kind of comparing what it looks like, going to these places and what it looks like now to images and descriptions of the past. Actually using scientific sources. I use a lot of climate data to try and understand what the environment was like. Because, for example, one component that I didn't really talk about, but that I do focus on in my research, is concerns among, particularly among foresters and the Forest Administration, but also more broadly among the French intellectual elite, is concerns that deforestation is having other environmental effects such as flooding, erosion, and desiccation. And so, in my research, I'm trying to determine where are these ideas just arbitrary, you know, or is it just superstition, or were there actually more cases of flooding and drought and things like that during the period that I'm looking at? And so I can get some of that information from documents, but climate data actually tells me a lot as well. And the climate was changing. In the 19th century, the world was coming out of a little ice age. And that's another factor in changing lifestyles and changing economy that I didn't really talk about either, but that I do examine in my research. So climate data, what else do I use? I use some, I guess you would call it anthropological comparison. So anthropologists starting in the sort of early decades of the 20th century actually traveled with some of the remaining transhuman groups, not just in Provence, but in Algeria and throughout the Middle East and in Turkey as well. And so some of their data is useful to me, some of it isn't. Yeah. But in some cases it's better than nothing. And then, you know, kind of wherever we can get information that's relevant and useful from other fields, we try to think creatively and kind of think outside the box.
Right. So. Great. Do you speak French? In German then?
German and Swahili.
That's what okay, yeah. So that would be required, I would think. Did you have a question?
Oh, I wanted to follow up on the gentleman's other question related to keeping people out of the forest to decrease the risk of wildfires starting. How does that fit in with the mandate of the French, I don't know if it's called the French Forest Service, but the French Forestry Department on what the purpose of those forests are for?
Okay, so the challenge of answering that question is I'm looking at two different time periods. But in the 19th century, the period that I was focused on, the primary idea is that forests are supposed to be productive. They're supposed to be non-inhabited spaces to grow trees that you can then use for things like construction. Well, primarily construction. And that goes back to one of the main inspirations for the development of the scientific forest administration, which was the Napoleonic Wars, which had a huge negative impact on forests in France. And there was a real fear that we're running out of forest resources after building all these ships so that Napoleon can go and conquer the whole world. And indeed, French forests were at their lowest extent ever in about 1822, just before the passage of the new forest code in 1827. So it had a real immediate impact. And so the main concern was that the traditional practices where local inhabitants would go into their forests and pick up firewood, and sometimes not just pick it up, but actually take it off of the living tree or graze their animals there, especially goats. Goats were seen as particularly detrimental to forests, but sheep were also a concern. They're both close grazers, and especially in forest with young trees. So that was a concern. And then even just people going into forests at all was a concern, not just because of fire danger, but because of other kinds of damage that they could inflict on the forest. Now, the current regulation, the Forest Administration has evolved a lot. I should say that, first of all. And I think in many ways it's evolved to be more responsible and more effective and sensitive to the landscape and the economy. But in the current forest regulation that eliminates or limits human use of the forests in the summertime is because in the Mediterranean region, the nature of the environment with the hot, dry summers is such that the majority, if not the vast majority of fires are human caused. And that's a little bit different than like in Colorado. Certainly they can be human caused, but there are also, we're more likely to have like a lightning storm in the summer than these kinds of environments are.
Any other
Does that answer your question?
Any other questions? I guess final question, what's next in your research? We'll start with Thaddeus. What are you going to be focusing on the next couple of years?
I'm sure I'll still be working on this. And so my aim is to write a sort of an international history of Rinderpest that looks from the German origin in about 1850. That part of it I have not yet done. And that looks at facets of the project from 1850 to really about 2010 when Rinderpest was eradicated. So I think this will preoccupy me for some time.
Right. It sounds like a huge topic. And Andrew?
That's a good question. This is going to keep me busy for a little while. I'm working on developing it into a book, but I have some other things that I would like to return to. One of them is something that I discovered along the way while I was researching this project, and that is I started to look at the eradication of undesirable pests, and specifically the eradication of wolves in France. And the really interesting thing about that is, and this has a current day comparison too, is that in the 19th century, wolves were virtually wiped out all across France and much of Western Europe as well, deliberately poisoned. And where I encountered this in my research is I would be reading about pastoralism, and there would be government correspondence giving recipes for poisoning wolves. Now, until the 19th century, most pastoralists lived with wolves, and you know, like the stories of like The Boy Who Cried Wolf and Little Red Riding Hood. They just had these really vicious sheepdogs to protect the herd, or supposedly to protect the herd from the wolves. And the danger with that is that occasionally the sheepdog would actually eat the sheep, and thereby be sort of counterproductive. And so the shepherds weren't entirely satisfied with the situation, but they dealt with it. But they kind of complained, and then in the 19th century there was really a massive national campaign to eliminate all the wolves and other undesirable species, or species seen as undesirable, and pests too, for agriculture and different kinds of things. But as a result of that change, the pastoralists who continue to practice transhumance didn't have big sheepdogs anymore. Instead, they had smaller, sort of smarter but less aggressive dogs. So it really changed the entire industry. And now the interesting thing is that there's a big movement to bring back wolves, and they have started to make a comeback. And so a lot of pastoralists are really upset that they now suddenly have wolves eating their sheep, and they blame it on these sort of ignorant activist environmentalists who don't understand the industry and just think wolves are cute and don't have to actually deal with their impact. So that's one thing that I would like to return to.
That'd be fantastic. Well, I think we're out of time, so thanks a lot for sharing, enlightening us about your research and also environmental history. That was really educational for all of us. So let's have a hand for Dr. Williams and Dr. Sunseri, first of all. And one thing this was nice turnout.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great group. On November 12th, which is Wednesday, this one from 3 to 4:30, right here we'll have Bernard Rollin. He's a philosopher here at CSU, and oftentimes controversial and provocative and good at that, and he enjoys that, and he's going to talk to us about ethics of human-animal interactions, and I think for this group he'll kind of do some more focusing on wildlife interactions. And so that's coming up, and we'll send out some. And I've also got a sheet over here. If you could give us your email if you want to be on our list, that would be great as well. But thanks for coming. After this, we're going over to the Black Bottle Brewery, if you can join us for a soft drink of some kind. It's becoming a carbonated beverage of some kind. Yeah, we don't want to promote anything. But thanks a lot for coming. And thank you. Yeah, it was great.